Alright guys, welcome to F1 News. The drama intensifies at McLaren. Rumour has it Oscar Piastri has made the decision to throw the Papaya rules out of the window in this title fight from now to the end of the season. Not just because he believes it's a good idea, not just because Marco Webber believes it's a good idea, but also the most recent McLaren World Drivers' Champion, Lewis Hamilton, believes that's the way to go as well. Hamilton apparently has told Piastri, look, don't give up any more positions if McLaren tell you to. Oscar, it seems, agrees. This is going to get spicy. Very much intro to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. We're going to start actually with a couple of dramas that were not really talked about much during yesterday's Grand Prix. Everyone knows who watched the race that, yeah, not much happened, but there was some action further down the field. It's just most of it wasn't really shown. The race direction was actually just terrible yesterday compared to what we'd normally expect. Sainz made, I mean, it's not usually great, but this was especially bad. Sainz made solid progress. He scored a point in the end. He went from P18, climbed up the order, made about 5 overtakes on the run. Alonso had some great overtakes. Behrman had that overtake, I think on Albon it was. Pretty spectacular. We did see it on the broadcast, but only like once. It was only a brief replay. Wasn't anything great. So there was also a bit of drama between Hadjar and Alonso. We did get to see a little bit of this, but Hadjar says, I didn't push him off the track. I kept it clean. He didn't enjoy the fight. He's really grumpy. Nothing I could do for him, which I thought was pretty funny. Doesn't feel that long ago. What was it, Cota last year, when Alonso and Lawson got into a bit of drama. Lawson now, of course, Hadjar's teammate, so it seems like that Racing Bulls car does not make especially good friends with Alonso. Alonso was definitely, he had a fair few things to say on the radio at the end of yesterday's race because of Hamilton and the Ferrari ahead of him. As we know, Ferrari, though, have had a shocking time of things. This was an interesting video that Clara here puts together, pretty much looking at every single radio message when Leclerc was told to do some lift and coast. And, well, I can just scroll through here briefly, and you guys can see from the top left-hand side that basically every single lap, like so many occasions, Charles was getting told, this rear left brake caliper is going to explode. Like it's going to give up on us. You've got to do more lift and coast, more lift and coast, more lift and coast. People joke about it all the time now, right? They're like, well, you turn up to Mexico, you're going to have to do a big lift and coast down into turn 1. People are saying, well, if Max was to go to Ferrari, like imagine how much plot he would lose with all of this stuff. So, Ferrari have frankly just built a terrible car that has so many problems. And the reality is that it's only getting worse, right? I mean, let's not forget these last 2 weekends were considered Ferrari's best chance of a win, right? Like Baku and Singapore were considered, apart from maybe Vegas, which still seems very unlikely, but these slightly more unorthodox circuits, maybe that was the chance for the redemption of the SF25. But in fact, everything has just been disastrous. And there's lots of talk now that Vasseur is increasingly under pressure, maybe just because it's been so bad. I think there is truth to the fact that it looks like Ferrari are going to get 4th in the Constructors this year. It's not guaranteed. It's, I think it's still going to be a battle there, but it doesn't feel like they're getting seconds. 3rd is possible. We'll see the data in a second on that. And maybe it shouldn't matter anyway. The focus should be on next year. But the fact that it's got to this point, I think for Ferrari, it's really the trajectory, right? The fact that they started this cycle of regulations with a very, very competitive car, the F175. And here we are at the end of the cycle, and it feels like they've massively lost their way. So there's talk about what next for Ferrari. There's discussion from the Italian press, as you might expect, that this complete collapse in the second half of the season because, Hamilton won the sprint in China. Leclerc had a handful of podiums during the first part of the season when the car was, not great, but not totally terrible. It's now just getting worse, right? Remember they brought that rear suspension change, thinking it would fix all their issues. If anything, the car's just got worse since then. John Elkann, Benedetta Vignette can and must address this. They've got to ask themselves whether this technical staff can realistically build a better future. Leclerc and Hamilton right now feel like an expensive luxury wasted on a car that exposes them to doubt and embarrassment. So the Italian press aren't happy about it, and understandably so. This is the driver's standings. The numbers are all quite clean here. So McLaren have exactly double the points of Mercedes, which is quite aesthetically pleasing, with 650 to 325. Ferrari have 298, only 8 points now ahead of Red Bull. You know, there was a time that it looked that Ferrari would secure seconds relatively easily because, while Russell was doing better than the Mercedes guys, Antonelli was further behind, and, you know, the Ferrari, or Russell was doing better than the Ferrari guys, whatever, you know what I'm trying to say. The Ferrari drivers were extracting basically everything out of that car, at least in terms of what was happening in the races. They were putting in solid performances, they were doing what it takes to try and secure championship points, really, and it looked like Ferrari were going to have enough, maybe not the second best car, but they had a good enough driver pairing that was going to get them over the line. The reality is now, the car's fallen away. The Red Bulls got better, the Mercedes has got better, the Racing Bulls has got better, right? The Williams has got better. You know, other cars are starting to be a threat, even the Aston Martin to a certain extent as well on certain tracks. And Ferrari are now 27 points behind Mercedes. It's far from insurmountable, obviously. They could still get seconds, but it doesn't feel like that's going to happen. It feels now far more likely that actually they get fourth. Red Bull are only 8 points behind. Max is scoring plenty of points every race weekend. Yuki had a pretty horrible one this time, but again, it's Singapore, you can't overtake. Who knows if the race was overtakeable? Maybe he'd have had a better time of things, but of course his qualifying was not good, and, well, we already know Tsunoda's getting replaced anyway next year, to our understanding. The point is, Yuki probably will score a handful more points from now to the end of the season. You can probably expect him to be in the points a few more times, given the progress Red Bull have made, and Max, you can expect him on the podium several more times. So, you know, and Ferrari, what are you expecting? 6th and 7th, right? Like, that's pretty much where they've been for some time now. So, it feels very plausible that Ferrari dropped down even further, which would be totally embarrassing, and Leclerc agrees. He even says at the moment it feels like you're just a passenger of whatever this car is going to do. So, he knows 2026 is critical. Hamilton knows 2026 is critical. The reality is, Hamilton's got his 7 world titles, right? Like, as much as he would have loved to come to Ferrari, them deliver him a great car and he ride off into the sunset, look, who knows, maybe next year that will happen and all the pain of this year will work out for Ferrari fans. But what are the chances of that, really, right? Like, this is Ferrari we're talking about. For Leclerc, it's more important. Hamilton can decide when he likes. You know, it's been a pleasure, guys, but I'm going to call it a day. Leclerc can't do that. Leclerc's got to decide where his future is best spent. Is it really still Ferrari, or is it another team potentially at some point like Mercedes? The reality is George Russell won the Grand Prix in dominant fashion this weekend. It was such an impressive weekend for him. It's kind of funny when people are like, in qualifying, I heard people say, does everything gets P1? And, you know, because usually the meme is does nothing gets P1. And then the race people were saying does nothing gets P1. So, you know, obviously George doing nothing was basically driving a dominant race from start to finish, right? So, yeah, he nailed it. Feel not vindicated, but, you know, the other day we talked about the most underrated drivers on the grid, and, you know, I mentioned that George Russell, to me, is definitely in that conversation, and a few days later, he takes a very shock pole and win in Singapore. So, it's kind of remarkable to think about, but this season, the World Drivers' Champion is almost certainly going to be a driver who many will consider to be third in terms of the best drivers of the season, because I think pretty much everyone probably has, I think in my opinion should have, the 2 best drivers of this season being Max and George. I think it's pretty hands down. You can probably argue one over the other. I'd still take Max first. You know, he's Max, but, you know, I think that is definitely the argument. So whoever wins, if it's Lando, it could be Max, right? But if it's Lando or Oscar, I think best they can hope for is to be considered probably the 3rd best driver of the season, which is pretty rare when it comes to championship winners. But Mercedes also have to make their own decisions. George wants a new contract. He will get a new contract, but the terms of that are a question mark. Antonelli apparently has a multi-year deal with the team, and Mercedes are going to announce it soon. Toto even said just the other day, Kimi ain't going anywhere, right? So that is pretty static. Again, the question is for George, that while he might have been the 2nd or even the best driver of this season so far, Max is still there, and as a result there are questions. George isn't apparently very satisfied with the terms of the arrangement. As I said the other day, I think George will be forced into signing a 1+1. I don't think he's going to get away from it. The question becomes, can he negotiate terms that at least give him a better deal, right? Like, that's what he will be trying to do. If he realizes that Toto is not going to give him a 2-year deal because of the Max option in 2027, then George will just have to probably accept that and keep winning races, which, I mean, George is just so good for Mercedes, right? Like, I mentioned it this most recent season. If you drop George for Max, there is something in that for sure, but also George fits the mold so well. He's so like unproblematic when it comes to bringing in Jos Verstappen and all these other things that Max brings in terms of an entourage. He fits the Mercedes billing so well from like a cultural perspective. Like he's so well aligns. You know, people call him Mr. Mercedes, right? Like it makes a lot of sense. The way that he is, the way that he approaches things, the kind of PR face that he can put. He doesn't always do it, but the PR face that he can put on that makes some people not like him, and I understand that. You know, George is an exciting driver to have on the grid because he's somewhat controversial. Some people like him, some people don't. It's good to have drivers that people have opinions on, in my opinion, because that makes people care about the sport. So George just ticks so many boxes, I think, for Mercedes that, you know, they're not going to like get rid of him precisely. But again, we know that Toto wants Max, and the question, I guess, is whether Antonelli is ever going to be as good as George has now become. And that's also a question that is worth answering. But George, understandably, will want some sort of other relationship there. There was a rumour that if he outscores Antonelli by a certain amount next season, a certain percentage, then he will be able to get a mandatory extension on his contract. But again, contracts can just be bought out if Max did, let's say, want to come to Mercedes. But also, he's looking to change the length of the deal, of course, to be a longer term one. Probably not going to happen, or at least reduce the number of marketing days. Look, he loves Mercedes, he loves working for them, but as a driver, they have loads of commitments for all of the sponsors on their jerseys, and he would prefer not to have to do that, right? So he's going to say, look, Toto, if you're going to give me a 1+1, at least give me all of these things that at least favour me. But let's talk about McLaren, because up on the podium, Oscar was not there with the team when they celebrated their victory, which was definitely controversial, but as I said yesterday, there was a bit more to that than initially met the eye. What is true, they went down to the pit lane, they celebrated together, Oscar put on a smiling face and was seemingly quite happy. But as we know, things were not all sunshine and rainbows. I think you could tell how furious Oscar was because on lap 1 of the race, they had the incident, and on lap 58 or whatever, like 62, when the Grand Prix was over, then Oscar was, well, he disconnected his radio while Zak Brown was telling the team congratulations, which was just absolutely fantastic stuff. We know that Mark Webber, this is Jenson Button, but we know that Mark Webber doesn't enjoy a number one driver type situation. He has plenty of experience at Red Bull during the Sebastian Vettel days of certain team decisions not going his way. Webber will have a very clear and astute opinion. We know what he thought about the swap in Monza, right? Well, we don't know what he thought. He was asked to comment on it by Coulthard, or he was at least, the point was raised by Coulthard, and Mark Webber kind of made a face as if to imply, I would never have done that in a million years, right? Now, I do believe that Oscar has yielded to many of these team orders this season. Even you can rewind to Australia, the conditions were wet. Oscar was told, don't attack Lando, we're just going to hold positions in this phase of the race. You know, even stuff, which is probably a fair team order, right? But even situations like that, Oscar's been very compliant to basically everything all season. And I understand why he's done it, because it keeps the team on side. But as I said a few rounds ago, there comes a point where the championship is close to its conclusion, where the cost-benefit analysis is no longer in favour of keeping the team on side. The cost-benefit analysis now favours you, the individual, especially now the constructors is all wrapped up. It is going to be every man for themselves. And Oscar, I'm sure, realises that. I'm sure he realised it in the car yesterday. And yeah, that crash between Lando and Oscar looked pretty bad from Oscar's perspective. It looked like Lando had just, counter-steered and driven into him and pushed him wide. That's not what happens. He hit the back of Max. That forced him into, it was a racing incident. We talked about it yesterday. The reason why Lando was slightly more compromised there is also because Oscar himself pushed Lando a little bit tighter in that corner because they were racing, right? This is what racing drivers do. And people that are complaining about what we saw yesterday, I don't know, at the end of the day, this is racing. Isn't this not what we're here for, right? You've got to get your elbows out sometimes if you're trying to win a title, and that's what Lando did. Oscar would have done exactly the same thing. If you're a fan of Max, you would have been celebrating if Max had done the same thing. This is racing. This is what we're here for. The point is that the reason why it was dramatic is because McLaren, again, handled everything horribly. They came over the radio and they gave some spiel to Piastri as to why they weren't going to yield the positions. All they needed to tell Oscar, really, was look, Lando hit Max, therefore he came into you, and that would have maybe diffused a little bit Oscar's feeling that he barged him out of the way. It's like, no, Oscar, that's not precisely what happened, and yeah, Oscar would still feel aggrieved, but I don't think it would have been to the same extent that they were. McLaren insists, it was just hard racing, it was a fair instance. And, I agree, but I do think that Piastri is well within his rights to say, look, there have been so many occasions this year where both of us, but Oscar also have listened to team orders and have done what the team have told them, and now he doesn't feel like that was especially fair. So the question really has then become, what happens next? Kim Illman said in his video that he put out on this that he'd spoken to people in McLaren and other people in the paddock, and their understanding was that the gloves are now off. The Papaya rules are basically over. Now, maybe Oscar will say to Zach Brown, he'll say to Andreas, oh yeah, sure, you give me a team order, I'll definitely be complying with that team order, don't worry about it, right? But if we turn up to Abu Dhabi and all of a sudden Oscar's got to yield a position because Lando's got a slow pit stop, there's no way that's going to happen. I do think to some extent the reason why yesterday was interesting is because Lando got a bit of damage from his contact with Max. It didn't seem like Oscar really had any. He might have had some damage, but it didn't seem substantial. If Piastri had put a load of pressure on Lando and was hounding him the whole race, maybe into a mistake, then it would kind of have backed up the idea that it was unfair that his teammate passed him. And as it turned out, Lando just had a bit more pace. So even with the damage to it, kind of, Piastri can feel frustrated, but also I think from Piastri's perspective, he has to recognise, and I think will now recognise that, it's time to do the talking on the track, right, rather than over the radio, and we are going to see that. So on Thursday, Hamilton was asked to give Piastri some advice, what to do in the title fight, because the most recent Drivers' World Champion that McLaren have is Hamilton, way back in 2008, right? Since then, it's been all over the shop, Brawn, and then Red Bull, Mercedes, Red Bull, all the Drivers' Champions over the last decade and a half, pretty much 2 decades at this point. So Hamilton's opinion is, from his time winning championships, being at Mercedes, when the battle with Rosberg was at an absolute peak for a time, don't give back any more positions. That was the advice. I can understand why Oscar did it in Monza. The 6-point swing he didn't feel like was enough for the team, consequences that would have had. And I can understand that decision given the Papaya rules and the way that McLaren like to operate. But I think Hamilton is bang on the money here. If they come on the radio anymore and say, you've got to give this position back for whatever reason, you just got to tell them, it's a pleasure hearing your opinion, but I respectfully disagree. That's what Hamilton and Rosberg used to do. Sometimes they would get told the team would prefer you to do this. The driver would say, I would prefer to do this. I'm driving the car. That's what I'm going to do. So this was then put to Oscar, and Oscar says he's been in that position many a time. I will take the advice. Now, I presume kind of what he meant, because Oscar's well PR trained, is I will take the advice on board. I will consider it. But kind of the way this sounds, and maybe this is the way that he meant it, is that, yeah, I'll be doing exactly that. I won't be giving back any more positions, and I will be listening to word for word what Hamilton has suggested. So I guess the question now becomes, what does this mean for the rest of the season? We've got 6 rounds to go. McLaren are now Constructors' champions. So it's all about the drivers at this point, and it's every man for himself. Lando is now 22 points only behind. If it wasn't for the DNF, as we know, in Zandvoort, it would basically be a tied battle at the top, but it's still very close, right? I would love this battle to go down to Abu Dhabi. I think that it may well do at this rate, and I would like to see that happen. Piastri would not like to see that happen. He would like to see it get resolved sooner than that, and, well, to do so, I think he's got to some extent, start taking matters into his own hands. I think Lando will recognise that as well. Lando won't be oblivious to the idea that Oscar is also going to be taking the gloves off. I wonder what it means for Lando, because let's say there's another slow pit stop situation and the drivers are swapped. They will come on the radio and tell the driver to yield, because they kind of have to, because that's what they did in Monza, right? But the driver, let's say it's Oscar, will likely say, sorry lads, but it ain't happening this time. My question is, what if it happens to Lando? That's when things get interesting, because I think the general feeling is over the last couple of rounds, there have been a few things that have favoured Lando, and Lando probably knows that Oscar is taking the gloves off and he's willing to put it all on the line. That's certainly the talk as of today and the big rumour anyway. I'm sure that Lando will recognise that. But if Lando is in the position where they come on the radio and say, well, we did ask Piastri to yield for you back in Monza, we've probably got to ask you to yield for Oscar right here. And then what does Lando do? Does he do it? You know, saying, okay, fair enough, Oscar, like, you helped me out back then. Or does he say, every man for himself, right? Like, yeah, I benefited from that earlier in the season, but I know that right now Oscar would not do the same. So I'm not going to do it either. You know, I think McLaren have made this incredibly dramatic. They didn't need to, right? Like, if McLaren didn't try to control the what you might call the uncontrollables, they wouldn't be in this position, and it would be every man for himself, and it would be rival versus rival. But instead, you've got this really weird dynamic where Lando probably still feels like he needs to listen to the team, but Oscar probably feels like, is this team really here to support me? And if he doesn't feel that way, then not only might he consider his future away from McLaren going forwards, but he also might think, okay, what have I got to do to get this title over the line? And I'll do whatever it takes. And I'm sure that Mark Webber would be on board with that. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.